Okay, good morning. This is the HSPN, Homeless Service Provider Network, domestic violence session for our resource and training series. We welcome you here. This is being co-sponsored by the Greater Bristol County Attleboro Taunton Coalition to End Homelessness, or GBCATCH, the HSPC, Homeless Service Providers Coalition of Fall River, and again, the Homeless Service Provider Network, the Continuum of Care for New Bedford. We're very grateful today to the Women's Center for sharing with us their Community Services Director, Hassan Souto. He will be presenting information and guidance about recognizing and responding to and referring to victims of intimate partner domestic violence. And I know he's going to cover a number of topics. We're fortunate to have Hassan with us. And with that, I want to turn that over to him. We will have this information available on our website and YouTube channel. It will be at www.nbhspn.com. With that, the floor is yours, Hassan. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. Jen, thank you so much for that introduction. I just wanted to give a couple trigger warnings. The topic of domestic violence and sexual assault can be a very triggering topic for people. I'm not sure if many of you are aware of the work we do, but 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in Massachusetts have been exposed to domestic violence. So if at any point you feel like this training is triggering for you, please take a moment for yourself. Or if you have any questions, you have 3 options. One of them is I'll have my coordinator of education and outreach in the chat, and she'll be providing ancillary information to this training. She'll be available to answer questions in the chat. You can save your questions for the end, or if there are any questions that you have that are more of a personal nature, or if they have to do with maybe a client that you're working with, you can give me a call at 508-996-3343, 508-996-3343, and I will also repeat this information at the end should anybody wish to make a referral to us or have a one-on-one. So with that said, I'm going to begin with our training. My purpose in designing this training for you guys was as professionals and providers to be able to recognize, respond, and refer. I call those the 3 R's. So my hope is that by the time we conclude this training, you'll be able to recognize symptoms and red flags of domestic violence, respond to a client or a loved one who discloses domestic violence, and refer them to the many services that we have available at the Women's Center, as well as one of the other 15 rape crisis centers in Massachusetts. I like to start this training and all trainings to talk about statistics because I've been doing this work for many years now, and these statistics are very jarring for me when you think about 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men having reported experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. These statistics should feel very sobering when you think about, if you look at, I don't know, if you're in school, how many participants are in a classroom? When you're in line at Starbucks, how many people are in line with you? When you have a move-in with your family, how many people in the room could be victims of domestic violence that you're not aware about? And we'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like, about why doesn't a victim disclose? Why do they feel uncomfortable disclosing? But let's take a look at some of these statistics. And because we have a lot of information to cover in an hour, I'll be giving what I call cheat codes. Cheat codes are information for providers such as ourselves, things that we need to take in mind when we're working with victims of domestic violence. So the cheat code for here is that the statistics in Massachusetts are higher than the national average, which means that in New Bedford, they're a lot higher than they would be, let's say, in another city in the United States. So 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have been injured by an intimate partner. Intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crime. Women between the ages of 18 and 24 are most commonly abused by an intimate partner. So you want to think about your college students and people in that age range with that statistic. On a typical day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines. The Women's Center operates 3 shelters, 2 in New Bedford and 1 in Fall River. there are only 258 domestic violence shelters in Massachusetts. And I can tell you, being the director of the Rape Crisis Center, that we are always trying to mitigate these calls and see what other options there are for victims, because there's absolutely a greater need for beds than there are beds. And I know a lot of you work with homelessness, so I'm sure you can relate to that information. In 2008, domestic violence was declared a public emergency in Massachusetts. This is a terrible thing, but it did provide some very necessary funding that has helped us mitigate a lot of gaps for a lot of victims of domestic violence. So when we talk about domestic violence, it's important for me to review what the definition is, because domestic violence means many different things to many different people, and it's also changed a lot in the last 20 years. I'll get into a little bit later why I try to use the word intimate partner violence. So we'll start with domestic violence. The cheat code here is that it's a pattern. It usually isn't a one-time behavior. It's a pattern of coercive behavior, which we'll get into, and intimate relationships where the behavior of another person is controlled through intimidation, fear, physical, emotional, and sexual violence. About 20 people per minute are physically abused in the United States. These are the statistics that I like to talk about because I think they're very sobering to show you how pervasive it is as we go about our day. Domestic violence can occur between parent and child, caregiver and elder, husband and wife, and same-sex partners. We'll talk about this later, but when we think about the work we do with the LGBTQ community, we have to recognize that they are at a greater risk for us because they don't have the same access to services that we do. Domestic violence is always about power and control. What does that mean? That means that it has been statistically proven that if you try to intervene with a perpetrator or an abuser with an intervention such as anger management, not only does anger management not work for perpetrators and abusers of domestic violence, it's been statistically proven to make it worse. So if you are working with a batterer and you're not sure what to do with them, you have a couple options. You can give me a call, you can call one of the professionals at the Women's Center, or you can seek out a batterer program, which there are a couple in Massachusetts, but anger management is not a viable option for perpetrators of domestic violence. Types of abuse. This is an important topic because at the Women's Center, we recognize different forms of physical, emotional, financial abuse, which means if a victim calls here and they've just been a victim of financial abuse, they have access to all of our services. They have access to counseling, groups, medical advocacy, court advocacy, housing, residential, all the programs that we exhibit, not just financial. And I think that's an important point to make because sometimes there have been interventions where people have gone to court with their victims and they've had a hard time if there wasn't financial abuse. But the rape crisis centers in Massachusetts do recognize these other forms of abuse when they're working with victims. So the physical one is quite, pretty obvious. I'm not going to go over too much: hitting, slapping, punching. Sexual abuse, a lot of times where there is physical abuse, there is sexual abuse. Emotional and verbal. We have buzzwords like gaslighting, undermining a person's sense of self-worth. Their self-esteem is the target. Constant criticism, diminishing one's abilities, name calling. And I think the cheat code here is that in physical abuse cases, 80% of physical abuse cases exist emotional abuse. Financial abuse, I've had, when I was started at the Women's Center, I'm also a licensed social worker, so just in my counseling practice, I had a woman who came twice just because she was experiencing financial abuse and the toll that it was taking on her. So we don't want to minimize any forms of these, but especially emotional and financial, because they may not leave a scar, but they leave a really indelible impact on the victims that are exposed to financial abuse. Even when a person's a victim of financial abuse, when you extricate them from the abuse, it still exists, right? Because they might have issues getting a bank account because while they were in their financially abusive construct, their credit score got diminished, or they weren't able to open a credit card. So now, they're not able to get access to things that they don't have cash for. Spiritual and cultural abuse. And when you think of spiritual and cultural abuse, just know that that can go both ways. That can look like one imposing their spiritual and cultural abuse beliefs on someone, and it can also look like the opposite. It can look like one not allowing the person to express their spiritual and cultural beliefs. Technological, we've seen a huge rise in technological abuse with the proliferation of the internet, things like stalking. So that means things like, having to block somebody, they create a new account. We do a lot of work with the kids at New Bedford Public Schools, and we see a lot of this, and it's pretty pervasive. We see it with adults as well. And the advice is usually, try to block that person, but then they create a new account. So if you are working with someone and they're a victim of technological abuse, you can go to third district court and you can try, if there's enough evidence, to try to get what's called the 258E. The 258E is a harassment order, whereas the 209A is a restraining order. So the only really method right now to combat technological abuse, if the person can't extricate themselves from it, is to try to identify the person who's responsible and get a harassment order against them. Power and control. I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this training that the crux of domestic violence is power and control, and to keep that in mind if you're a provider as one of the cheat codes. So this diagram right here, if you come to the Women's Center as a victim of domestic violence and you get involved in any of our groups or counseling, we use this diagram to help illustrate for victims and survivors what power and control can look like. And it does look like a wheel. At the center cap, you have power and control. And at the spikes, you have the coercive control that I mentioned earlier. And then the wheel itself, while it says physical violence here, you can replace physical with emotional, financial, technological, spiritual, cultural. And the cheat code for this diagram is that all these spokes are very insidious because they don't leave a bruise, they don't leave a scar, they don't leave a cut, they don't leave anything that can result in an ER visit. So let's start at the top with using intimidation, making someone afraid, using looks, actions, and gestures. This is something that can be done in a room full of people, and the only person who notices it is the abuser. Using emotional abuse, name calling, mind games, putting someone down. And this wears away not just at a person's self-esteem, but at their self-efficacy and their self-concept. And that can have a lasting damage that supersedes the person leaving the victim. I work with a young woman who's a case manager in New Bedford, and she's been away from her victim for 10 years, but she'll tell me that every now and then on a Friday night when she's getting dressed up to go out with her girlfriends, she'll look in the mirror and just get a spike in her heart and hear some of the nasty things he said to her. So that emotional abuse is something that we want to think about, that once a victim extricates themselves from the abuse, it can have a lasting effect on their psychological well-being. Using isolation, jealousy, limiting involvement, controlling. We've kind of come out of the pandemic, but one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic was there were protection orders, stay-at-home orders that were put in place that were really meant to keep people safe, right? Well, for victims of domestic violence, the pandemic, according to the CDC, was a second pandemic because murder-suicides doubled and the severity of domestic violence increased 80% during the pandemic. Because if you look at things like economic abuse, intimidation, isolation, using the children, all of those coercive behaviors got multiplied when you have a person who's now working from home, a person who's been laid off from their job. Using children, this is one that we see a lot, making someone feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages. And this only gets compounded if there's any type of custody battle going on or any type of situation where with DCF, where the children have been, extricated from the primary caregiver. Using privilege, that used to say using male privilege, but to be more inclusive at the Women's Center, we call it using privilege because we do work with men who are victims of domestic violence. In my counseling practice, I worked with at least a dozen men who were victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. We also work with people who are LGBTQ. We work with people who identify as female. So we want to be cognizant of that and inclusive when we use language to describe abuse. So any questions about the power and control wheel that anybody would like to ask? Okay. Chat's going good? Awesome. So the next infographic that we use is the cycle of abuse. And the cheat code for the cycle of abuse is that for some victims of domestic violence, this happens in one day. And for other victims of domestic violence, this can happen in months. So what does that mean? That not everybody experiencing domestic violence experiences it to the same degree. So the honeymoon phase, apologies, blaming, gifts. The tension building phase could be, maybe somebody punches a wall. Maybe somebody gets more critical than normal. Maybe somebody displays more anger than they usually do. And then the explosion is whatever form of abuse the victim is being subjected to. Again, that's physical, emotional, sexual, cultural, technological, whatever it is. And again, the cheat code is that this can happen in a day for some people, or it can happen in weeks for some people. So what you think about when you think about, okay, well, what does that mean that it can happen in a day for some people and a week for others? That means that it can make it really difficult for a person experiencing domestic violence and intimate partner violence to extricate themselves, because it's not happening to them every single day. And when you think about the honeymoon phase, if somebody's apologizing and somebody's taking blame for their actions, or buying gifts, or telling you, you know what, you can forget that 209A, I'm really sorry about what I did. It can be really confusing to a person who loves another person to extricate themselves from them, especially if they're depending on them financially, especially if they're depending on them to be the primary caregiver, especially if they're depending on them because maybe they're from another country and the whole reason they're in the United States is at the mercy of this person. So we want to just be cognizant of some of the reasons why people stay in an abusive relationship, but I'll have more guidance for you as we get further into the training on that.
I have 2 questions in the chat.
What are the questions?
One is asking if there's any thoughts as to why the numbers are higher than Massachusetts and other places.
Yep. So Kayla just shared with me that somebody asked in the chat why the numbers are higher in Massachusetts. I can't answer that. So I'm a member of the Greater New Bedford Human Trafficking Task Force, and I do a lot of work with the Community Crisis Intervention Task Force, which means that we do a lot of work with the chiefs of police here. And I've asked this question myself, and this is the answer. When you are working in a location, a city, a town where you have higher incidence of poverty, you have higher incidence of unemployment, and you have higher incidence of violence, it compounds domestic violence. So the answer to that is domestic violence gets compounded when there are other socioeconomic factors affecting it.
And the second question is, do you have to be vaccinated to work at the Women's Center in the shelters?
No, you don't have to be vaccinated to work at the Women's Center. We have new leadership here, and a couple years ago you did, but I'm happy to say that that is no longer a requirement to work at the Women's Center. And we actually are hiring for quite a few jobs. And if you're interested, give me a call or go to Indeed. But yes, you do not have to be vaccinated to work at the Women's Center. Is that all? Okay, awesome, great questions. So this cycle of abuse, we don't really show it a lot, but I'm showing it because I'm working with providers on this training, and I want you to also be able to see what this cycle of abuse looks like from an abuser's standpoint, okay? So from an abuser's standpoint, the honeymoon phase is them giving apologies, promising it won't happen, justifying their behavior, blaming drugs, declaring love, promising to get help, enlisting family support. So imagine you're a victim of domestic violence and the person that you love is doing all of these things to mitigate their abuse. I mean, it's human nature to want to forgive, especially if it's somebody you love. Now compound that with you're depending on them as the caregiver of the children. You're depending on them because they hold the health insurance. You're depending on them because they have the credit. You're depending on them because they have the car. It's a lot more persuasive when you're relying on this person for shelter and food. The tension building phase, the abuser gets very sensitive and they're nitpicking. They're withholding affection. and they're acting, quote unquote crazy, destroying property. And then the acute explosion, which is the victim's response, is verbal humiliation, slaps, punch, kicks, chokes, grabs, all of that. Again, sometimes we think the worst case scenario is a broken bone or a black eye, but I've worked with hundreds of victims in the last few years, and they've told me, and this is just anecdotal, that they can heal from those things, but it's the emotional abuse that tends to stick with them. And I think that can make sense to a lot of people looking at it through that lens. So let's talk a little bit about why in the last 20 years, professionals who work in domestic violence have begun using the term intimate partner violence, okay? So intimate partner violence is abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship. And this can refer to current and former spouses and dating partners. They don't need to live with each other. Intimate partner violence can vary on how often it happens and how severe it is. That term domestic violence came from an era where people were getting married, having children, and living in a home, hence the word domestic. And it's important to have an intimate partner violence lens, because if we don't, we're not going to ensure the legal access to protection orders to people who don't live together, okay? Intimate partner violence can occur regardless of whether the individuals involved are or were living together. And this is the distinction that separates from the term domestic violence, which, like I said, generally refers to violence occurring between residences and people who live across state, who live in different cities. And again, this term has assisted us in moving away from the old view that violence only occurs in marital relationships where the husband was the physical abuser and the wife is the victim. I think a lot of us who work with homeless people who experience domestic violence and here at the Women's Center have seen that that sort of cookie cutter, the man's slapping the wife, is not what we're experiencing in real time. So it's important to update our language on that, more specifically so that we can make sure that there are protections from law enforcement and the courts for victims of intimate partner violence. Domestic violence occurs in dating relationships as well as marriages. Women aged 16 to 24 experience domestic violence at the highest rate of any age group, almost 3 times the national average. And that's why at the Women's Center, we've done a lot of workshops and trainings with college students. They actually did a study in 2016 that 80% of college-age women didn't realize that they were being abused. This is an actual study that came out. And the reason they didn't know is because this was their first relationship. A few years ago, they were in high school, and now they're living across state in a dormitory, being abused, and they thought it was normal. So they weren't even aware, so how are they going to get help? So that's where my education outreach piece comes in, about having, trainings just like this, talking about statistics, giving cheat codes, giving some of the evidence so that we can help spread awareness. The rate of marriage has declined steeply over the last 50 years. People, particularly young people, are dating much longer than in previous generations. So as people get married later in life, dating violence will continue to rise. And given the prevalence of domestic violence within these dating relationships and a shift in structure of relationships today, communities have to work together to ensure that victims of dating violence have access to resources and increase some legal protections. And I realize I've repeated that a few times, but that's sort of the crux of why I'm trying to put the word intimate partner domestic violence out there, or make people aware of intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence versus domestic violence. Intimate partner violence includes any behavior that one intimate partner, current or former, uses over another to establish power and control. Regardless of what we call it, the crux is always going to be power and control. These can include physical or sexual violence, but they don't always. They can be financial, emotional, psychological, cultural, spiritual, reproductive. We've been seeing a lot of reproductive where, and it goes both ways, the person's being forced to use contraceptive when they don't want to, and the reverse, or any other controlling behaviors. While they may appear to be the same thing, and they do have a lot of overlap, domestic violence and intimate partner violence are 2 different terms with different meanings. Domestic violence is violence that takes place within a household, and can be between any two people within that household. Domestic violence can occur between a parent and a child, siblings, or even roommates. We've seen that as well. Intimate partner violence can only occur between romantic partners who may or may not be living together in the same household. The prevalence of intimate partner violence. So I know when I talk about the distinction between intimate partner violence and domestic violence, I want you guys to be aware of the differences as providers, and especially not just as providers, just in case this is happening in your own household or somebody discloses to you, but there is a lot of overlap. So when we work in New Bedford Public Schools with high school age kids, we call it dating violence, but dating violence is intimate partner violence for adults. It's common and it's pervasive, and the statistic is the same, which is approximately 1 in 3 women and 1 in 10 men and 1 in 2 transgender individuals. So think about 1 in 2 transgender individuals being victims of intimate partner violence if you do any work with the LGBTQ community or any type of outreach, or you know anybody who's in the LGBTQ community. 2/3 of rape cases are related to intimate partner violence. That's pretty scary. 43% of college women who are dating have reported experiencing violence or abuse at the hands of their partner. 13% of college women report that they have been stalked. Of these, 42% were stalked by a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend. So I think we're seeing a pattern here. Intimate partner violence is a leading cause of injuries and homicide for women. And whenever I do trainings like this for law enforcement or the New Bedford Police Department, I invariably have, a lieutenant or a sergeant raise their hand and like Hassan, from what they're seeing, from what law enforcement is seeing, they believe that these statistics are even higher. So imagine telling a group of law enforcers that 1 in 3 women in New Bedford, and they raise their hand and tell you that they feel like it's higher. That would mean half. Let's talk about some of the warning signs. These warning signs are important for us to acknowledge and to be aware of, just in case we work with somebody who's a victim or we end up somebody that we know discloses, because some of them, because they're part of the cycle of abuse for people, they have become so ingrained and indoctrinated that they may see them as normal parts of their partner's behavior. So physical aggression, this one's pretty obvious, right? Slapping and hitting. They're unpredictable. Their moods tend to change rapidly. Is there an underlying mental health reason for this? They're jealous and suspicious. I can tell you that we do workshops at the at the junior high schools in New Bedford, and a lot of the kids, they think this jealousy and suspicion is really cute. They think it's very alluring. And we teach them that at their age, it can be. You do want to feel like your partner gets jealous if you're talking to your ex, but this is usually a red flag that this person may not be able to provide a healthy relationship for you. They control their partner's money. They make important financial decisions with shared money by themselves, or they take their partner's money without permission. Verbal threats. They're not afraid to name call, swear, and yell at a partner. Isolation is probably one of the bigger ones on this list. They limit their partner's use of the phone or other sources of communication, texting, limiting their communication with their loved ones, with their family, etc. Blaming. They try to blame their partner or others for their behavior. And this is where we get into things like gaslighting and a lot of threats. More on red flags. So when I was putting this PowerPoint together for you guys, there was so many red flags and so many warning signs. So I wanted to try to get them down to like the top 10 warning signs of dating violence, and they're using insults, extreme jealousy, isolation, unwanted sexual contact of any kind, not just sexual assault or sexual abuse, explosive temper, constant monitoring, invasion of privacy, leaving unwanted items, gifts, or flowers. We've had a lot of situations here where this leaving unwanted items, gifts, or flowers resulted in a 258E, which is the distinction for a harassment order. And the person on the other side was like, I thought I was doing a good thing by leaving items, gifts, and flowers, using alcohol or drugs, and threatening or causing physical violence. Again, it's not always just about the Physical Violence Act for victims of domestic violence, but sometimes it's just about that threat of feeling like at any point you can get physically assaulted. Victim's perspective on leaving abuse. This slide comes from some actual research on what it's like from the victim's perspective. So the cheat code for this, if you don't remember anything else, is that it takes 7 to 9 times for a victim of domestic violence to leave their abuser. Why is that important? Every time somebody calls the Women's Center for help, I keep in mind, this could be one of those 7 to 9 times that this person tried to leave. So we want to do our best to make sure that we listen and we get them the resources they need, because if we don't, it might be a long time before they try again. So leaving is not easy. On average, it takes a victim 7 times to leave before staying away for good. Exiting the relationship is the most unsafe time for a victim. When a victim extricates themselves from domestic violence, they are at the highest risk for homicide that they will ever be in during their relationship with an abuser, okay? As the abuser senses that they're losing power, they will often act in dangerous ways to regain what? Power and control over the victim. To an outsider's eye, the issue of domestic violence can be black and white. Just leave. It's that simple. Why would you stay with somebody who's abusing you? That sounds foolish. For those left physically and emotionally black and blue, that zero tolerance perspective isn't clear. And I urge everyone, especially if this is what you do for a living, to not have a zero tolerance perspective. And I will get into some guidance on the exact steps you can take if a client or a person you love discloses domestic violence. We'll talk about that toward the end. Why stay in an abusive relationship? I put that question up there because I get, not so much now, but in the beginning when I was a coordinator and a manager here working more with the public, why stay in an abusive relationship? And it doesn't make me sad to hear that. I like hearing that because I like to provide a little bit of guidance on why people stay in an abusive relationship so that we as providers, and if somebody we know or love discloses to us, we have a background in why they stay. Or forget being a provider or somebody we love, just so that we can educate people around us on why victims stay. So these are just some of the reasons. I think I came up with 50, but these are some of them. Fear. A person will likely be afraid of the consequences. Normalized abuse. This is a big thing. 1 in 15 students in New Bedford public school system have been exposed to domestic violence. So what does that mean? If someone grew up in an environment where abuse was common, they may not know what a healthy relationship looks like. As a result, they may not recognize that their partner's behavior are healthy or unhealthy or abusive. If I'm a child and I'm exposed to domestic violence, and let's just say my family construct is mom and dad. If in my family construct, I see dad, being aggressive to mom and mom being passive, as a child, I'm going to grow up thinking, for me to get what I want, I need to either be passive or aggressive. Cultural context, traditional customs or belief absolutely influence someone's decisions to stay in an abusive situation, whether they're held by the survivor or by their family or community that imposes expectations on them. Love, I kind of skipped over that one, but I shouldn't, because that's at the crux of most relationships. Shame, it can naturally be difficult for someone to admit that they've been or are being abused. It's not really the first thing that you want to say to somebody, especially if you have a limited support system. You can feel like you've done something wrong. And we do a lot of work with sexual assault victims, if any of you don't know. And shame is at the crux of what we deal with when we visit somebody in one of the hospitals because they've endured a sexual assault. Intimidation. The survivor may be intimidated into staying in a relationship by what? By those verbal and physical threats that we talked about earlier. Even if there's no physical violence, working with victims, we've learned that just the threat, that impending doom that you're going to get hurt, or that somebody you know or love is going to get hurt, can be intimidating for you enough to keep it a secret. For LGBTQ plus people who haven't come out yet, imagine you haven't come out yet and now you have to call 911 because you're a victim of domestic violence. How does that work? I know in New Bedford, we're lucky to have many LGBTQ networks. I'm actually on the board of directors of South Coast LGBTQ, and I'm really proud of that. but there are a lot of rural areas and places where there are no LGBTQ centers, there are no LGBTQ resources, so those people are at greater risk. Disability. We do work with the DPPC a lot on people who are being abused, and it's quite sad. So if someone depends on another person for physical support, they may feel that their whole well-being is directly tied to that relationship. Obstacles on leaving. The first one, disability. If someone depends on other people for physical support, they may feel that their well-being is directly tied to the relationship. A lack of visible alternatives for support can heavily influence someone's decision to stay in an abusive relationship if they have a disability. You also want to remember that isolation was on the power and control wheel as one of the spikes. And isolation is really huge because if you can be an abuser, a perpetrator, a batterer, those are the three words that we colloquially and legally use to identify an abuser. If you've isolated a person enough, they're not going to have a support system to even disclose to. Immigration status. People who are undocumented do fear that reporting abuse will affect their immigration status. And unfortunately, some of them are right for that. If they have limited English proficiency, these concerns are amplified by confusing and convoluted legal system and an inability to express their circumstances to others. At the Women's Center, we happily work with undocumented individuals. We have a partnership with the CDEC. We have programs and case management here for individuals who are undocumented, as well as Spanish-speaking counselors and groups. So if there's an intersection between anybody who's listening to this training right now and they work with undocumented people, give us a call and we can assist with that. Cultural context, traditional customs or beliefs may influence someone's decision to stay in an abusive relationship, whether held by the survivor or by their family and community. I remember a few years ago when I started talking about spiritual abuse and cultural abuse, I got a few people who scoff at me because like, oh, now we're talking, yes, we are. That's where we're at. We're at a place in 2023 where we're trying to be inclusive toward the communities that we work with. Children. Many survivors may feel guilty or responsible for disrupting their familial unit. Keeping the family together may not only be something that a survivor may value, but may also be used as a tactic by their partner used to guilt a survivor into staying. We see this every single day. Love. Experiencing abuse and feeling genuine care for a partner who is causing harm are not mutually exclusive. Survivors often still have strong, intimate feelings for their abusive partner. This is natural. They may have children together, want to maintain their family, or the person abusing them may simply be charming. As a matter of fact, we try not to get into the profile of an abuser, but I've done a lot of work on it with the DA's office and with the Human Trafficking Task Force, and abusers do tend to be very, very charming. That's why when we look at using anger management as an intervention, not only does it not work, it's been utilized to further abuse people. When a victim discloses. So this is a good point to sort of start to talk about what happens when a victim discloses. And then at the end, I think the last slide, and I'm going to email all of this to Jen, there's a cheat code that you can either write down or print out that you can provide. It has a few steps on exactly what to do based on evidence and best practices when a person discloses. So friends and family are often an integral part of the victim's way out. Who the victim discloses the abuse to first is critical to whether or not a victim is able to move past abuse healthfully. A lot of survivors tell someone and are then blamed or shamed by that confidant, which shuts them down. If victims feel supported, they may grow stronger and more confident. If an abuse victim feels judged by a friend or a family member that they disclose to, he, she, or them could lose trust, withdraw, and become skeptical of talking about the abuse to anyone else. Victims must make the decision to extricate the abuse circumstances themselves. He's controlling decision-making, he or she or them are controlling decision-making. So if you seem to control their decision, it's not good. I took a lot of care when I wrote this slide right here because it's a little bit of a convoluted situation. I was trying to make it as clear and concise for everybody on what to do when a victim discloses. Are there any questions? No? Okay, perfect. If someone you know or love has just disclosed to you in confidence that they're experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence, you want to be prepared on how to respond. That was another part of my training here that we'll get into. Initially, hearing someone you love and care about is being abused is shocking, and your reaction might be to badmouth the abuser. This reaction is human, but you must refrain. They still have some attachment to their abuser that they do not fully understand, and you attacking that person to them will only shut them down from speaking to you in the future about the situation. I took a lot of care in writing that because in a lot of so at the Women's Center, let me rewind a little bit. We also work with secondary victims at the Women's Center. A secondary victim is a person who is not the direct target of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, but all of us serves at the Women's Center, groups, counseling, secondary victims have access to that too. Okay, so in the work that I've personally done here with secondary victims, this has been the big thing. Hassan, let's say a female's being abused and she tells her brother, I'm just going to use this as an example. The brothers that I've worked with, they all want to get together, go out and beat this person up. That's natural. You love your sister and you're finding out that somebody in your age group is smacking her around. And what we want to do is validate those feelings that, yes, you want to protect this person that you love. Nobody wants to hear that their little sister or their mom or their grandmother, because we've seen that too, is being abused. But in our effort to make sure that we're helping the victim as much as possible, it is showed based on research and best practices that when that happens, you shut this person down. If it takes the average victim 7 to 9 times to leave their abuser, and one of those times when they get the courage to disclose, their abuser ends up in the hospital or bashed, you're putting that victim and unfortunately, unintentionally and inadvertently, you're putting that victim more isolated because now they feel like they can't talk to you because you're going to bash the abuser, and they're not in a place yet. They're not in a place yet where they're ready to 100% leave that person. So that's something to keep in mind. Are there any questions about that? No? More tips for handling disclosures. If someone discloses to you that they're experiencing domestic violence, it's important for you to first not judge them, and second, to assure them that they're not to blame. I think I've talked about this a few times now, that blame and shame, not only is it something that they inherently feel as a victim, but it's something that society puts on them. When you think about things like rape culture, and when a person, if they call 911, let's say it's 2 men who are in a homosexual relationship and they call 911, they're not out and they don't live in a city or town that's inclusive, they're going to get judged for that. I've heard horrific stories about people in the LGBTQ community calling the police from different areas and literally getting laughed at, and it breaks my heart. They do not cause any of these actions against them. Be mindful of your response and be patient with them. Do not bring up any sensitive information or question them unless they bring it up first. What I mean by that is, if you do have somebody who, whether they're a client or somebody personal, disclose to you that they are a victim of domestic violence, the next time you see that person or talk to that person, never bring it up, because you don't know if, one, if they're in a place to talk about it, and two, if they're on the phone, you don't know who's in the background or who's on the other side of that FaceTime phone call. Help them create a safety plan, or be sure to give them an actual location organization like the Women's Center. It doesn't have to be the Women's Center, but evidence shows that if you tell a victim of domestic violence, there's help out there, they're not going to get it. Evidence shows that a victim of domestic violence is more likely to receive help if you give them an actual resource. Hey, you can go to Star in Fall River. You can go to Independence House. You can go to the Women's Center. What's the question?
Can you talk a little bit about what happens when someone calls the Women's Center for safety? We often hear that they're just told that there's a women's shelter. How does it work when someone really needs to flee to an undisclosed location?
Yes, I can absolutely talk about what happens when you call the Women's Center. So I stated earlier that there are 258 domestic violence shelters in Massachusetts. And I make the distinction because the domestic violence shelter is going to have case management and programming, whereas some homeless shelters, an individual, let's say from 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., they have to be out of the shelter. The domestic violence shelters are 24/7. They have programming. The person does not have to extricate the facility. Yes, sometimes when you call here, you will be told that we don't have a bed. Sorry. We don't have enough capacity like every other shelter in Massachusetts to say yes to everybody. I wish we did. So when we are full, we do work with SafeLink, and a lot of times, and I know this isn't what people want to hear, you do have to revisit those conversations about maybe a relative that the person can stay with that's not ideal. Maybe they have a relative who lives in another part of Massachusetts and they'd rather be in New Bedford, and I understand that. But they're just, the black and white answer is there are not enough domestic violence shelters in Massachusetts to keep up with the demand. So what I recommend that people do, and again, I know it's not the greatest, is to revisit those conversations of any options they had of fleeing the domestic violence that weren't ideal. Effects of domestic violence on adults. So we've kind of talked about the psychological and emotional long-term effects, but based on research, domestic violence also has physical effects. These are some of the, there were a lot, but these are some of the main physical effects of domestic violence. So you might have somebody who presents with some of these issues and it's due to domestic violence. I'm not going to read all of them, but the biggest ones that were sexual and reproductive issues and traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury has been one of the rising issues with domestic violence, with people who are in physical abuse situations where they're constantly getting their head slammed up against the wall, the floor, or getting punched in the head. As far as psychological, now these are more long-term. So this is somebody who's been exposed to domestic violence for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder is a very, very common one. And that's for people who've endured domestic violence for even short term. And substance abuse disorders come out of either them learning substance abuse from the victim, from the perpetrator, or as a response to dealing with the domestic violence if they can't extricate themselves from the relationship. And I just like people to see some of the more long-term physical and emotional impacts that it has. And by the way, both these columns have been observed in victims of domestic violence who've extricated themselves from the domestic violence relationship. More on long-term effects of domestic violence. The mental health effects of domestic violence are likely to be severe and long-lasting. Exposure to violence and abuse increases one's risk of experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and unfortunately, suicidal behaviors. The most commonly employed element of domestic violence, coercive control, is a pattern of domination enacted through tactics designed for intimidation and entrapment, and has particularly damaging effects for mental health. Practitioners are also seeing the use of digital coercive control, whereby perpetrators utilize technology to monitor and track their victims, creating a sense of omnipresence, isolation, and ostracism. I put that in there because a lot of the work that we do with the younger generation, but all generations, because it's pervasive, is you're always online, right? Your phone's always on. There's somebody on Snapchat, Instagram, all the time. And the bad part is you block them, you create a new account. So that's something to keep in mind too. And also, people, what were the air tags? People putting air tags. I don't know if anybody knows what Apple AirTag is, but I'll tell you, it's just a little device. I keep it on my keychain so that if I lose my keys, I'll know where they're at. In the last couple of years, people have been throwing them in women's pocketbooks or in people's cars, but Apple came out with an update so that if you have one of these Apple AirTags following you, you'll now get a ping on your phone. And from the research I've done, that came out of them acknowledging that abusers were using these to track victims. Short-term effects of domestic violence. Some examples of short-term effects of domestic violence can take on adults, might result in bruising, cuts, and broken bones, minor injuries sustained from violence, muscle tension, involuntary shaking, shortness or loss of breath, emotional effects such as shock, confuses, changes in eating and sleeping patterns, confusion and mistrust of your own instincts. A lot of times when we work with the younger generation who are exposed to domestic violence, they tend to be very resilient. And I'm talking about secondary victims of domestic violence because we want to make sure that we acknowledge secondary victims as well. But for the primary victims of domestic violence, especially when you do go on that spectrum closer to physical violence, there's a lot of physical aspects to it that once the person extricates themselves, they now do need medical attention for a lot of these issues. And if you find that you're working with somebody who's a victim and they don't have health insurance, the Women's Center doesn't take health insurance, and we're able to provide all of our services free of charge without health insurance. Incarcerated victims. So we have an incarcerated victims program here. We work with Bristol County Sheriff's Office, and we have a counselor who once a week goes there and provides groups. The reason why I wanted to touch about this wasn't to promote this program, but was sort of to give you guys a little bit of a cheat code that when you're a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, okay, and you become homeless or you become a runaway, there are things that you may do in your survivorship that turn you from a victim to a perpetrator. This is sort of my reason for putting this in here. So, for instance, a woman in prison, 80%, 86% identify as survivors of sexual violence, okay? 77% identify as survivors of intimate partner violence. So a lot of these women who are in prison ended up there because in their survivorship, their victimization led them to perpetration. Preventing intimate partner violence. Primary prevention. So we have a department here at the Women's Center called Education Outreach, and my cheat code for this slide is that it has been proven that primary prevention has reduced victimization and perpetration. Primary prevention can look like the training I'm doing with you right now. Primary prevention can look like my education outreach department going and working with, remember earlier I mentioned 1 in 15 students in New Bedford, children are victims, are exposed to domestic violence. 1 in 15 students in New Bedford public schools are exposed to domestic violence. This has been proven that when you provide primary prevention, what does that look like? That looks like a training on healthy relationship and risk factors, that those trainings decrease that children's chance of becoming a primary victim of domestic violence. Men in domestic violence. We've seen in the last few years more awareness around the fact that men are victims of domestic violence. I've said it and I'll say it again, at the Women's Center, we work with all victims of domestic violence. The fact of the matter is 85% of victims of domestic violence are usually female, but we do serve that 15% of that are, LGBTQ and men here at the Women's Center. And we also try to do a lot of work engaging, fathers, men, and boys, and educating them about domestic violence, because if they're not a perpetrator of domestic violence, they can also be allies, okay? So when you do your work with domestic violence and you work with people, just remember that yes, men can be perpetrators, but they can also be allies. You can teach them about affirmative consent. No means no, but yes means yes as well. And if you need any guidance on that, give us a call, because we've been trying to do a lot of work. We have a men's group here, we have an LGBTQ group here, and we're trying to do everything we can to cross the spectrum when it comes to intimate partner violence and domestic violence. This is more on engaging men. So here are some resources. I know somebody had a question earlier about Safe Plan. These are some other numbers that you can write these down, or when I share this PowerPoint with Jen, you can print this page out, or you can call us anytime. Especially if you're doing work with people who, let's say that they're a teen and they really don't want to talk to a counselor. I think that the Love is Respect National Teen Dating Abuse Helpline, you can also text. Like, somebody can actually sit there and text if they're witnessing abuse at home, if they don't want to speak to somebody. And that's a resource that some of our teens and some of the junior high schools here have utilized. Upstander versus bystander. This is just, if you do any work with teens and children about teaching them when they see something, say something. And the reason why we do that, and it's more of a bullying thing, but the point is to plant a seed with young people so that as they get older and they start to witness somebody that they know or love be a victim of domestic violence, that their sort of introduction to being an upstander and a bystander with bullying will translate into them being adults who witness people being abused and speak up about it. How to make a referral. So I don't know if anybody on here has worked with the Women's Center before, but we have streamlined our referral process. We now have an intake department. We have the same 3 people who do all the intakes, and they have language capacity for English, Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and Haitian. All you have to do is call 508-996-3343, and it's a 10 to 15-minute intake process. Once that's done, the client has access to all of our services and never has to do an intake again. If it's after 4:30, they can call our 24-hour hotline, which is 508-999-6636, and they can speak to someone. I know I'm running out of time. All right, so this is the last slide. This is the disclosure cheat code. This is what I wanted you guys to either write down, take a picture of, or print out when you get a chance. If someone you know confides in you that they're experiencing domestic violence, these are the different things you can do to help them, and I would do it in this order. Number 1 is to believe them. Number 2 is to acknowledge the complexity of the issue. Number 3 is to make sure that they know that they are not to blame, that it is not their fault. Number 4, as hard as it is, do not bash the abuser. And number 5, last but not least, give them a resource. And that is the end of my training. I think I did it on time, Jen.
Somebody wants to know if that text number is just for teens.
That text number is just for teens, yeah, but I mean, give them a call and see if they have an option for adults. That's what I would do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hassan. This has been an absolutely fantastic and insightful and helpful session for all of us. I know we're grateful to you. We're grateful to you, Kayla, for providing such great information in the chat. Those of you who have not seen what's in the chat box, take a look. We will be posting this video on our website as well as the PowerPoint. So I know a lot of you have had questions about specific things on there. So that will be available. We want to thank you for your attendance today. If anyone has any idea for future sessions that you'd like to see, future trainings you'd like to attend, if there's something out there that you think, why haven't they talked about this? I'd be happy to hear your suggestions. And you can reach me through the city website, jennifer.clark, Clark is an E at the end, at newbedford.ma.gov. So I'll put that in the chat box, but thanks so much and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan.